My name is Christopher Longwell, and today I'd like to share a remarkable story about my journey to the space between here and there, a profound near-death experience. This life-changing event dates back about 10 years, a pivotal moment that completely altered my perspective. Before this, my life was fairly typical, though I always had a bit of an alternative edge. I was a Harley enthusiast, riding motorcycles since I was just a kid. Alongside that, I was a tech guy, running a business with my brother. My time was split between cruising on my Harleys and working on computers. My two young children were my world. They brought so much joy and growth into my life, constantly challenging me in ways only kids can. Then came one unforgettable night, during 4th of July weekend in 2005. After spending the evening at Jugs and Strokers, I left late, around 2 a.m., and hit the road. I was riding along the Meadow Brook Parkway, heading northbound, cruising, the way I normally did. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a pickup truck driving unnervingly close to me. Something felt off. As I took a closer look, it hit me. The driver was going the wrong way, heading north in the southbound lane. I couldn't quite wrap my head around what I was seeing. Was this really happening? Was he part of a construction crew? I tried to rationalize it, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. After a few moments, it became clear that something was wrong. The car was heading in the wrong direction, and suddenly, the guardrail separating us disappeared. The driver was now moving dangerously close to my vehicle. I realized that if he became aware of his mistake, he might swerve directly into me. Acting quickly, I switched over to the far lane, crossing 3 lanes to get as far away as possible. Just moments later, I saw the driver pass under a bridge and collide head-on with a limousine. The crash was devastating. He caused the death of a 7-year-old girl and the limo driver. Despite it being late at night, people quickly gathered at the scene. Seeing that help had arrived, and knowing I couldn't contribute anything more, I drove home, shaken but certain there was nothing else I could do. I went to bed, but the following morning, I saw the incident featured on the front page of the newspaper. Authorities were asking for witnesses to come forward. I chose not to, thinking the situation was straightforward. Reports suggested the driver had been drinking, and the details seemed indisputable. I pushed the whole event out of my mind and moved on with life. About a year later, someone pointed out a newspaper article to me. It was about a trial. The driver was being prosecuted for second-degree homicide. At that moment, I knew I couldn't remain silent any longer. I reached out to the authorities, shared what I had witnessed, and testified as a prosecution witness during the trial. Walking into that courtroom was one of the hardest moments of my life. The man on trial didn't look anything like me, and while I wasn't perfect, I fully understood the weight of the situation. I was determined to follow through, but I couldn't help thinking how easily it could have been me in his place. I gave my testimony, truthful and straightforward, and spent 2 days on the stand. I honestly believe my testimony shifted the case in favor of the prosecution. There were many issues with the case, but ultimately, the man was found guilty and sentenced to 16 years in prison. That experience had a profound impact on me. I vividly remember the victim's parents, devastated and angry, feeling the sentence wasn't harsh enough. I empathized with them deeply, but at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about how young the defendant was. It stayed with me for a long time, the pain on both sides of the courtroom. After that case, I knew I couldn't go back to my usual life. I sold my share of the business to my brother, who was also my partner, and dedicated myself to being a full-time dad. That decision came from witnessing the heartbreak in those families. I was determined not to miss out on my children's lives or repeat the same mistakes. During this time, I did some side work in computers, but focused on raising my kids. Eventually, I became more involved in my community. I was elected to the local school board and even led efforts to clean up a toxic waste site in the area. That trial changed me. It reshaped how I saw life, family, and the impact we can have on the world around us. It was such an incredible time in my life. I felt like I had truly found purpose, not just for myself, but for my family as well. Life was going great. I live on Long Island, which is also home to the Hamptons, where all the celebrities go, and where the beaches are beautiful. On Sundays, I loved taking my Harley Davidson out for a ride to a little roadside barbecue spot. It's one of those small stands you could easily drive past without noticing, but it became a favorite of mine. One Sunday, after grabbing some barbecue and heading back, I encountered heavy traffic. It wasn't just the usual beach crowd. Something had caused a major backup. Maybe it was an accident or some emergency roadwork, but the cars were backed up for what seemed like miles. I was on my brand new Harley, but the weight of the bike combined with the heat and the endless traffic made it tough to wait. I noticed other drivers using the shoulder of the road to take a right turn and escape the gridlock ahead. After sitting there for a while, I decided to do the same. As I reached the intersection, a car in the oncoming lane slowed to let a truck make a left turn. Just as the truck moved across, it collided directly with me, and everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the road, staring up at the sky. I could tell a lot of time had passed because the light was fading, and it was beginning to look like dusk. Flashing lights surrounded me, and that's when I realized something terrible had happened. At first, I didn't even know I'd been in an accident. It all felt so unreal. I tried to sit up, but an emergency worker quickly told me to stay down. That's when it fully hit me. My day had taken a devastating turn, and as soon as I got up, I felt bones sticking into my leg. It was like my leg was disconnected. I was just in agonizing pain. And then I laid back down on the road. And then the next thing I knew, I was flying through the air. I was going through the clouds. I just kept on going higher and higher and higher. I wasn't sure what was going on, but all of a sudden, I started to approach the ground. And then I looked down and I saw this big round circle on the ground. And I saw these buildings, and I knew exactly where I was. I was in a helicopter, and I was looking down on Stony Brook Hospital, one of the premier trauma centers in the United States. So I knew exactly where I was. And as the helicopter landing, I saw the emergency workers unbuckle me and take me away. And that's the last time I remember being here, at least in the here and now, for what seemed like many, many lifetimes. It was almost forever that I was away. And where I went is a place I call the place between here and there. I had grave injuries. I had a fractured spine. I had compound fractures in my hip. I had internal bleeding that was the most life-threatening. I had to go to surgery more than once for them to stop the bleeding because it was killing me. I had a traumatic brain injury. There were just so many injuries I could go on. The doctor once told me that usually when reading my injury report, he said this is more common on an autopsy report, not on someone who is alive. In my hospital room, in my hospital bed, once they got me stabilized to the rest of the world, I was hooked up to these machines, and I was laying in this hospital bed. But to myself, in my spirit, I was someplace else. I was in this beautiful, beautiful place. I was in a coma for a month, but in this place, I had so many experiences that it felt like I had more experiences in this place than I had in my actual life. See, here in this place is that time didn't exist the way it exists here. It's that the passage of time is based upon your experiences or things happening here. You see the sunrise, you see the sunset, you see the changing of the seasons. You have appointments in the future. There was none of that there. What it was, the way the passage of time happened, is that you had certain understandings and experiences in this place, and you grew from those experiences. And you could look back at your awareness, the growth in your awareness, the growth in your spiritual growth, and that gave you the sense of time passing. And so the very first place I was in a work-like setting. I didn't know I was anyplace else. I didn't know anything had happened. And I was helping people solve computer problems. But I began to realize that the problems I was solving really had nothing to do with computers. It had to do. There was a physical reason why we did things, but there was another reason. There was a spiritual learning and growth that goes from every one of our experiences. In this place, I learned what I first called the language of the universe. What I mean by that is that I was taught certain lessons. And what I believe is, this place is sort of like what the Catholics call purgatory. It's not the place you go where you pass, and it's certainly not here. But really what it is, it's a place of transition from your physical body into your spiritual body, to return back to that spirit. These are all things that I learned there. I was a 0 on the spirituality scale before this experience, so I had nothing to work on. So I think I was going through Spirituality 101, and it wasn't like someone gave me a book and I opened up the book and, okay, Stephen, here's chapter 1. This is what you're going to learn. No, I had to figure everything out myself. Nobody's teaching you. You are learning through observing and experiencing and reacting to those experiences. For example, I was working with this fellow who I knew from real life, and he looked exactly the way I remembered him. And I recognized him right away and greeted him, and I helped him with his problem. And then I saw him again, but he was much older. He must have aged 50 years, and I recognized him. Of course I recognized him, and then I saw him again, and he was a child. But still, there was something about him. It was a saying, something he would say, or a mannerism. And I'd be like, I know who this is. You're so-and-so. And this went on, literally hundreds of times, that this gentleman appeared to me in all different ways. He appeared to me as a woman sometimes, as an older woman. He appeared to me as different races or different heights and different, just every way he tried to fool me. But what happens over a period of time is I didn't need to look at him. I began to be able to sense him. I was beginning to understand and sense his inner spirit. That part of us, all of us, that doesn't die, that really was never born, was created with the universe. I was being taught that we all have a spirit, and so once I understood and I could sense his spirit, I started to feel spirit in everything around me. Because now I could feel spirit in things, and I realized everything had a spirit. The trees, rocks, the planets, the universe, and all these spirits were different, but they were all connected. There was a commonness. And I began to realize that we are all connected. Everything is connected. And what I began to understand is that the Creator and the creation are one. And so that was the first lesson that I learned there, is that we are all connected. And then the next experience I had is that I've later learned to be a life review. And what I did is I reviewed all the things that happened in my life. Not that I was living them, or not that I was seeing them as a voyeur, but almost as if I was everywhere. That I was part of everything, and I was aware of everything that went on, and I was aware of every thought that everyone had around me in every situation. And all of a sudden, my life took on new meanings. Every interaction I had, I saw that it was different for everyone else there. Everyone had their own purpose for being in every situation. And so, when I reviewed my life, I would learn so many things about new situations. And I've learned so much wisdom from my experiences, and then when I completed my life review, my awareness was raised, and then I would do my life review again. Now I could look at my life review with a new set of eyes, with my increased awareness. And that went on time and time again. But as I began to address very deep and dark pains in my life, each time I overcame that dark episode, I would feel bliss. I would feel enlightened. I would feel like this big weight was lifted off me. Because I had an understanding of the meaning and the message, and that fueled my spiritual growth and my happiness. For me, the beauty was in being free from all the pains of life. It's that it was just imagine that you had no anxiety. You weren't angry with anybody. You didn't have any hate or jealousy towards anybody. No one felt that way about you. And it was blissful each time, no matter how difficult that life review was going to be. I knew at the end I would feel bliss. And then, when I stopped learning, I moved on to the next situation. And the next situation, I found myself in a restaurant. And I was in charge of these children, young adults. They were old enough to work, and I was teaching them how to work in a restaurant. No matter what I did with these kids, they would not listen to me. I tried everything, and I knew I was failing. I just didn't know what to do. Is that I tried red team, blue team, come on, let's go. And they would say, yes, 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 and they would. They'd look so sincere. But then they would be gone. And I was truly at my wit's end. And then there was a lady there who was always praying, and I didn't understand what her purpose was because everyone there had a purpose. But what this lady did, I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I felt this loving energy coming from her. It was like the prayer. It didn't matter what she was saying. The prayer was almost like a road, which is beautiful, loving energy rode upon to visit with me. And that did give me a strength. It really did, as I felt that she could have been saying anything, but it was a pathway to bring this healing, loving light to me. And finally, when I was at my wit's end, I stood before the owner and I wanted some guidance. And then the owner looked at me and placed his hands on my shoulders. And all of a sudden, everything changed. It was almost like Dorothy opening up the door and the Wizard of Oz and all the bright colors. It wasn't bright colors in that sense. But all of a sudden, I realized that I had totally misjudged the situation. I was dealing with the physical experience of what was going on, and not the spiritual situation of what was going on. You see, I was being taught all of these experiences, all this knowledge, and when the first time I got to use this experience, all this knowledge, I forgot about it. And I just saw the kids as dopey kids who wouldn't listen. But now, when I looked on the kids with a new set of eyes, I saw that they were really spirits. Spirits who had yet to have a human incarnation, and I was there to shepherd them, to mentor them into their first human experience. And when I stood before the owner, I began to realize something, that I was looking at me, that I was looking at my higher self, that part of me that is always in spirit. And just part of me comes down. I use the word down metaphorically, but comes down to earth to have a human experience, to make the mistakes that my higher self could never make. So I could learn and grow, and add it to my continuation of consciousness. I believe I was being tested to determine whether I would stay in spirit, or perhaps come down to earth again, return to my body that was still alive. And so then, I found myself in yet a third place. I come from this little town in Kings Park, Long Island, New York, very small town. And there's this place we call the Bluff. And at the end of the day, everyone from town goes to the Bluff and drinks coffee. Some people drink other things from, red Solo cups that isn't coffee. And we talk about the day, we find out who's doing who, and all the small town gossip. And I found myself there with two of my old friends, Joey and Johnny from Kings Park. And so every day, and I use the term day very loosely, but every day I sat with them and we'd watch the sunset together. And this went on and on and on, over and over and over again. And then one day as I realized something. I realized both Joe and John had passed earlier that year. And that was just so shocking to me. It really was, is that how could this be happening? It was the first time, even though I've been through all these crazy things, it's the first time that I began to realize that something's going on. I mean, really is that they can't be here. And I wanted to ask them why they're here, but I just couldn't do it. I don't know why, and it went on and on. And what was a pleasurable experience now started to be an experience of anxiety for the first time. This was the first time that I really had, fear. And each time I sat with them, I said, I have them to myself. I said, I have to ask them why they're here. And as time went on, my anxiety built, and it got almost unbearable. And I felt a certain urgency. One day, I felt like if I didn't ask them now, I would never get this opportunity again. And so I asked them, what are you doing here? And they told me, they're here to make sure that I'm all right. I'm all right. I didn't know what that meant. I'm all right. I really didn't know. I didn't remember the motorcycle accident. I didn't remember anything. All I remembered was this life that I was living. And up until the end, I was so happy. And then we watched the sunset. And as the sun set, instead of getting dimmer, it got brighter and brighter and brighter until I had to shield my eyes. And I shielded my eyes. And then, when I felt the light dimming, I opened my eyes. And I was in my hospital room. And my mother was holding my hand. And she was telling me that I had been in a terrible accident, but I was going to be okay. And that she was here for me. And that's the way I returned. But it wasn't like a light switch. It was like that moment, yes. But after that, it was like I was still there in that place and still here. It was a transition back to my physical body. And it took some time. But as time went on, as I started to realize something, that lady who was praying, I knew who that lady was. That was actually a dear friend of mine, a person who I was in the PTA with and who I went hiking with. She was my dear friend, a lady called Kathy. And I wanted so bad to tell her that I heard her prayers, but I was tied down and I was intubated. It was the first time I was tied down with my clothes on before, but I wanted to get the tubes out of me. And as soon as I got the tubes out of me, I was given my phone. And I texted her right away, and I told her I heard her prayers, and I wanted her to come see me right away the very next day. And Kathy came to visit me often when I came. Out of the hospital, out of rehab. And we'd go on long walks together. And sometimes I would talk about stuff, but most of the times I just kind of kept to myself. And she was an athlete, and so she really pushed me. She was the best physical therapist out there. And at this time, we were just friends. We had known each other for like 20 years. But as this went on, I started to have feelings that were, I think, a little different as I started to get better. But then one day, as I realized, there was such a surety of the outcome that I knew if I did these things, I would get better. I knew it, no matter how difficult it was. Because it was so difficult to walk. It was such a challenge. And then I thought of Joey and John. When they said I was going to be all right, they didn't mean there. They meant here. They meant here that they were going to be my spirit guides, that they were going to help me. Because Joey broke his back. I broke my back. Johnny lost his life from the diabetes, from the infections in his leg, and my leg was all busted up. Who better was in a situation to help me through this time? And it's not like they said, one more push-up, one more push-up. No, I felt their energy in the same way that I stood before my higher self. And I felt that energy. I felt their energy, and that's what gave me the ability to go forward. And then one day, I went down in my basement and I found my 20-year-old boy dead from a drug overdose. I mean, what do you say? It happened all of a sudden. 1 second, everything was wonderful. He's on a scholarship to a Division I engineering school. And the next moment, he's lying lifeless in my basement. And I thought of all the things that, how did I fail him? Really, how did I fail him? Is that being an old biker personality wasn't so funny now? And then one day, my cousin went to a medium to hopefully connect with one of her lost relatives. And the medium said, "A Nick is trying to come through. And that's my son's name. Do you want him to come through?" And my cousin said yes. And she said that, "Have you been seeing flowers?" And she texted us right away and asked if we've been seeing flowers. And we've been seeing roses. It's so ridiculous. We'd be hiking on the path in February and we see a rose on the ground. And we began to see roses in all these places. And Kathy was telling me, she's saying, so someone's trying to communicate with us. I knew who she meant by the someone, but I wasn't convinced by any of this. To me, it just felt so impractical, so far-fetched. Then the medium mentioned something about my son having a connection to St. Teresa and said he was sending flowers. One day, I was out on a hike with Kathy, and she asked if Nick had ever tried to reach out to me. Her question took me by surprise, and honestly, made me upset. I was still in the depths of grief, trying to process everything. Kathy had been so kind to me, but this idea of my son contacting me, it just didn't feel real. I was dealing with the raw pain of losing him, and she was talking about the medium and spiritual connections. I told her that mediums can look things up online, like on Facebook. I assumed she must have posted something about flowers or something similar, but Kathy insisted that wasn't the case. She said the medium didn't know us or have any way of knowing we were connected. I still wasn't buying it. Then Kathy pulled a small statue of St. Teresa from her pocket and placed it near a tree by a gentle stream, like something out of a movie. She had brought flowers, a rock, and a marker. She wrote a prayer for Nick on the rock, placed it next to the statue, and left the marker there. About a week later, we went back to the same spot. That time, Kathy brought along a prayer card she had received from my cousin, who had also gone to see the medium. It was a Saint Teresa prayer card. We really looked at the card for the first time, and that's when Kathy pointed out something I'd never noticed. Saint Teresa's birthday was January the 2nd, the same day as Nick's. Then I noticed something else. The date Saint Teresa was canonized was May 19th, the very day my son passed. How could that be? Could this actually be real? That night, as I slept, Nick came to me in a dream. He was saying goodbye, reassuring me that everything would be okay. In that moment, I found myself reflecting on the space between life and the afterlife. I imagined he was experiencing many of the incredible, beautiful things I had felt during similar moments. He was transitioning into spirit, and that realization was deeply meaningful to me. It connected with my own near-death experiences and helped me reconcile events from my past as well as those yet to come. Eventually, they caught the person who sold drugs to my son. He faced charges of second-degree murder, the same charge brought against the man responsible for the crash that killed the little girl, the limo driver, and others. I was determined to attend the trial. I built up so much anger inside me, preparing to vent my pain. I wanted that young man to feel the depth of my suffering. But when I finally saw him, standing there in the courtroom, I realized he was just a kid. A young, drug-addicted kid. He reminded me of the other young man who had been on trial before, and in that moment, I felt no anger. I didn't feel hatred. Instead, I felt only compassion for him. I wasn't consumed by rage as I had expected. All I felt was an overwhelming sense of love for this boy. I wanted him to find a better path, to turn his life around. I couldn't hold on to the anger. My heart was filled with empathy, not resentment. Looking back, I believe that trial, just like the earlier incident with the head-on collision, was part of my life's journey, a way for me to reflect and come to terms with everything that had happened. Those experiences prepared me for that moment, helping me find peace and understanding. They sentenced that young man to 16 years, the exact same punishment. I often think about him and hope that one day he manages to turn his life around. Reflecting on everything that happened, the 3 pivotal events I went through, it's overwhelming. First, there was the tragic accident where a young girl and a limo driver lost their lives in such heartbreaking circumstances. Then, there was my own near-death experience, which completely transformed me from someone with no spirituality to someone deeply connected to it. And finally, losing my son. Going through all of this, and then witnessing that young man's trial, it makes me wonder, how did it all unfold this way? I never felt during my near-death experience that my life was predetermined, but looking back, everything seems to align so perfectly. It's hard not to believe that these events are interconnected somehow. That near-death experience, as strange as it may sound, was the greatest gift I could have ever received. If there's one thing I'd want to leave you with from all of this, it's that life is inherently good, and people are good, even when devastating things happen. That's the truth, even if these words might seem insignificant right now. But if you can walk through life and find your own understanding of why this is true, you'll discover peace, not only in this world, but in whatever comes next. Thank you for listening to my story. Sat Nam, and may peace and love always guide you.